My name's Susie Johns, and in this video I'm going to talk about watercolour primaries. That's the three primary colours, red, blue and yellow. One of the most popular courses I teach is watercolour for beginners. When people join the course, they're often quite confused about what paints they need, what quality of paint, how many different colours they need and so forth. And I usually advise them to come along to the first lesson with just three colours, three tubes of paint. With just these three colours you can mix a whole variety of other colours. So it's a good place to start. I'm going to show you how to create a colour wheel with the primary colours and also talk a little bit about paint quality and what are the best paints to start with if you're a beginner to watercolour. So let's start by painting a colour wheel. You start by drawing a circle on your paper. I'm using Bockingford watercolour paper here. And then draw a smaller circle in the centre. Now draw lines across the circle like spokes of a wheel to divide it into 12 equal segments. Now you have the framework of your wheel, you'll need 2 pots of water, a palette and a paintbrush. And of course you'll need some paints. The paints I'm using here are White Knight's Artists Quality watercolours, and you can use any brand, and you'll need a red, a blue and a yellow. This blue is Ultramarine. So squeeze a small blob of paint onto your palette, and if you're using good quality paints you won't need very much. This is lemon yellow and it's brand new tube, so I'm just piercing the seal and I'm going to put that at the top of my palette. And lastly I have rose, and I'm putting this in the centre section of my palette. I'm just washing my paintbrush to make sure it's really nice and clean, dabbing off any excess on a tissue. And I'm going to go in with clean water and mix up a small amount of the yellow paint. And now I'm going to use this colour to paint the first segment of my colour wheel. I've made sure that I didn't dilute the colour too much. I'm using the full strength colour for the thicker part of the segment, and then I'm just going to add a little bit of water just to see how the colour looks when it's diluted. Now I'm using my second primary and I'm going to miss out 3 segments and then paint the next segment with this rose colour. I'm just going to wash off the excess paint and then just use a little bit of water just to dilute the colour. And this paler version is called a tint. And now for the third primary, the blue. Again, miss out 3 sections and paint the next section with the blue. When it's undiluted in its purest form, it's called a hue, and as I said before, once you dilute it, it's known as a tint. So there are the 3 primaries, the yellow, the red and the blue. And now we're going to try mixing 2 together. And when you mix 2 primaries together, it's called a secondary colour. So I've mixed a little more of the yellow paint, and now I'm going to add a spot of red. And when you mix red and yellow together, this makes orange. Try to mix a shade of orange that's sort of halfway between red and yellow. And then use this colour to paint the segment that's between the red and yellow segments. As before, fill in the lower part of the segment with a diluted version or a tint of that colour. For the next secondary colour, we're going to take some yellow and mix it with the blue. And of course, the resulting secondary colour is green. Use this mix to paint the segment that lies between the blue and the yellow. And then, once again, use a little clean water just to dilute the colour so that you can see what it looks like as a tint. And then for the third of the 3 secondary colours, mix some blue in with the red, and this makes violet. And because we've used blue and red to make this colour, it goes on the segment that's between blue and red on the colour wheel. Paint the top thicker part of the segment with this colour and then use a little clean water to produce the tint. Now there are 6 blank segments left to be filled, and these are going to be filled with what's known as the tertiary colours. And the tertiary colours are made by mixing a little more of the primary into the secondary colour. So here a little bit of yellow makes a yellow orange, and that sits on the colour wheel between yellow and orange. Mix a little more red into the orange to make a red orange, and that sits on the colour wheel between the orange and the red. So the next tertiary colour is going to be a yellow-green, made by mixing a little more yellow into the green mix that I made earlier. This sits between yellow and green on the colour wheel. The next tertiary colour is a blue-green, made by mixing a little more blue into the green mix, and this sits between blue and green on the colour wheel. The last 2 segments are made with violet, first adding a little more red to the mixture and then a little more blue, and these 2 colours sit on either side of the violet segment. Finally, by mixing all 3 primaries together, we obtain a neutral colour, a dark grey, almost a black, which we put in the centre of the colour wheel. I think it's useful to label the colour wheel with the brand of paint used and the colours that make up the colour wheel. And this is really useful for future reference, especially if you're using more than one brand of paint or a different selection of primary colours. So as a teaching aid and also to compare brands, I made a number of colour charts with tubes of paint like these Daler Rowney and these Rembrandt paints. And because I know that some people prefer pans to tubes, I also made some colour wheels using pans of watercolour paint. For the pans, as well as drawing out a colour wheel, I also drew a grid to fill in showing the colours in my palette, again as a very useful future reference. As before, Mixing the three primaries together gives you a neutral shade, and that goes in the middle of the chart. And now I'm going to fill in the little squares with the colours from the palette in the order that they appear in the palette and label them. Because when you're using pan colour, sometimes it's easy to forget which colours they are, and this provides a handy reference. Cats always want to know what's going on, they always want to be part of the action. Let me just straighten things up and carry on. So, as I said earlier, I made a number of different colour wheels, each using a different set of paints, and I thought it would be useful to compare them to see which paints I liked best. So I used Daniel Smith watercolours, White Nights, Shin Han, which are Chinese, Rembrandt, Daler-Rowney, Camel, which are Indian, Winsor & Newton, and Sennelier. I made an additional Winsor & Newton colour chart using different primaries to see what the mixes were like. And I made colour charts with pan colours, Daler-Rowney, White Nights, and also Derwent ink tints to see how they compared with regular watercolours. And I also made one with a budget brand of watercolour just to sort of show my students that it doesn't really compare at all with professional watercolours. Derwent ink tints are water-based, but they're kind of in a class of their own, and I'm not going to include them in this comparison. I'm just going to look at the artist's quality watercolour. So both the Daler-Rowney and the White Nights pans performed really well, and I'd recommend them to any of my students, particularly the White Nights, because they're very affordable. All the remaining charts were made with tube colours and all artist's quality watercolours. This is one of the Winsor & Newton charts. I'm going to put it to one side because I used cadmium red for this one. So these are the ones I was happiest with. I can compare them with each other because I used very similar colours. These are the Sennelier. I love these. They're really rich and the texture is lovely. This one, the Daler-Rowney Artist Watercolour, I use all the time. I really, really like those. Shin Han watercolours are really good quality, and so are these White Nights, and both I recommend to my students because they're excellent value. Daniel Smith are great, but they're expensive, and so if you're beginning, you might not want to spend the money. Rembrandt are in the medium price range. They're very good. Camel performed well, but I don't know where to buy them. And Winsor & Newton Artist Watercolour, I use those all the time, and again they're in the medium price range. I made these two colour charts to show how different primaries produce different results. The one on the left uses Permanent Rose, French Ultramarine and Lemon Yellow and makes good orange mixes and very good violets. The one on the right is made using cadmium red and cadmium yellow and cobalt blue, and the oranges are much brighter and richer, but the violets are a bit dull. The advice I give to my students, and that I would give to anyone starting out with watercolour, is to choose artist quality paints, only buy 3 primaries to start with, and make a colour wheel to see how your set of paints performs. I hope you found this useful. I'll be posting more watercolour based tutorials soon, and do subscribe to my channel. Thank you.